welcome to the Daring to Dad podcast. My name is Ryan. I'm the host. I'm also a coach. I work with dads one-on-one to help them cultivate more joy, reduce stress, and deepen their experience as fathers. Most importantly, I love this topic. I'm curious about how fatherhood and masculinity are shaping the world, how we can continue to improve our lives. And these conversations are just as much for me as they are for anyone else. I am thrilled to bring you my conversation with Dallas Hartwig. This is something I've been looking forward to for so long. A lot of you are already familiar with Dallas. He's a man of broad and diverse backgrounds, including rehabilitation medicine, strength and conditioning, nutrition, and functional medicine. This guy is a lifelong student. He's currently interested in the psychological, emotional, and spiritual growth of men. Sounds familiar? All of which are based on the foundation of physical health. Again, many of you know him from his 2 New York Times best-selling books, It Starts With Food and The Whole 30. He published his last book, The 4-Season Solution, in 2020. He's a men's coach and father of 2 and lives in Salt Lake City, Utah. I'm thrilled to bring you my conversation with Dallas Hartwig. Dallas, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. Full confession, like when I was like, hey, I want to do this podcast. It's time for me to start. I want to do this. This conversation here was at the top of my list of I want to have this conversation. So I'm just incredibly grateful that you're here, taking some time. Thank you for being here.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm honored that you would even say that or think that, but I'm thrilled to be here and just to chat about stuff that matters.
You know, most people probably know your name from like It Starts With Food, like The Whole 30. Like these are, I know, like some things that you've done in the world. I was actually the first book I picked up of yours that I read was The 4-Season Solution.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and I loved it. I loved the structure. It was super instructive, for me. And when I thought about you, I thought about like things like health and nutrition and fitness and all that kind of stuff. And I started following you on social media. And shortly thereafter, man, you started putting out just some incredible content around men, and just the whole conversation that we're having culturally about masculinity and being a father, weaving in that. And I was just like, man, this is such great stuff. And I want to just maybe start here at the top and ask you, like, what has in your life has kind of brought you to this point where these conversations around masculinity, men's mental, emotional health are so important for you?
Good question. There's like the personal side and the kind of like big, kind of cultural, societal side. My dad was present when I was a kid, physically, and just was not emotionally present. He just wasn't, there wasn't anything there to get a hold of. And so I didn't have a really positive, healthy, communicative, emotionally intelligent, paternal role model, which of course, for boys frames the whole rest of their life. And so that was kind of my, kind of early experience. My dad died of pancreatic cancer when I was 29. And, I have one younger sibling, a sister. And I sort of found myself thrust into this place of like, am I the man of the family now? Like, what does that mean? Like, I didn't have kids at that point. And it was just this sort of like reorientation of thinking about my responsibilities in my immediate family. And that sort of overflowed into thinking about my responsibilities in the larger world and in my community and my friend group and all that. And that was pivotal for sure. And I think the other part of it is just, I'm a man and I live in this society and in this world. I'm Canadian, but I've been in the US for a long time. And, it's a difficult culture to live in, and it's a difficult culture to live in as a man, for a variety of reasons. And then, so there's like sort of the personal side. then there's a sort of broader societal, cultural side. And I look out at the world and I see, as much as we talk about, deconstruction and patriarchy and all this stuff, like that's how the world operates. And as far as I can tell, how it will operate for the foreseeable future. Like change happens slowly, and it needs to happen. And when I think about, I now have two kids. My son's 11, my daughter's a little over 1. And I think about the world that I want them to live in, and it is not the world as it currently exists. And so I have this both desire for me to have a different lived experience, to have different kinds of relationships with men, to have different kinds of relationships with women and everyone, and also for the world to be different in the future for my own kids. And my sort of interest in men's work, really, as most of my public work has been in the past, was sort of a sort of turning inside out of what I've been thinking about and feeling and learning about and growing through over the past few years. And that happened in my earlier work with, strength and conditioning and nutrition and functional medicine. And I sort of did a lot of that on myself and learned a lot, and then sort of turned that in a public facing way. And this stuff with relationships and emotional intelligence and particularly masculinity and men's work is exactly the same as that. It's a personal experience and personal interest turned public. It's just sort of how it works for me.
Yeah. Why do you think you mentioned the difficulties in being a man? What are some of the challenges that we see in 2024 living as a man in the world? What are some of those?
I think there's so many. I think one of the biggest ones is men, broadly speaking, don't feel like they have a really concrete, meaningful place in society. And there's lots of talk about sense of purpose and meaning, and for most of the sort of civilized history, so we're going back now 10,000 years or something, men have been highly contributive and highly functional to building civilization as we know it, but largely as small cogs in a very big machine, as military units, and then today much more so as units of economic production. And we're valued for that. We are, I don't know if I go so far as to say praised, but that's where a lot of our individual and cultural value is derived. And that in and of itself doesn't have much meaning, right? You recognize that you're only as good as how much you can produce or how well you can perform or who you can win against or who you can dominate. And that's a very adolescent perspective. And I think that, the way that we as, pubescent adolescent boys kind of jostle amongst each other and spit talk and, we have there's a lot of sort of competition and sort of stratifying going on there. And I think that's a really appropriate developmental stage. And the vast majority of men never leave that stage. They spend their whole lives, including their entire professional lives, in that space. And that in and of itself is a very lonely, isolating, and precarious place to be, because you recognize like the guy next to you is happy to take your job if you falter, or if you get burnt out, or if you don't stay late, or if you don't, do everything to the best. It's also true, in the relationship world, like men are happy to step in and take someone's partner, it's a very precarious place.
Yeah. I
think the other thing too, and there's a lot of conversation around this over the last few years, thankfully, is that men, and I guess I'm speaking especially about straight men here, but men often don't, myself included, don't really know how to be in the world because there's so many mixed messages around, we want men to be masculine and strong, and we want them to be not necessarily unemotional, but stoic in control of their emotion in a mature and healthy way. And also we want men to be sensitive, and we want men to be engaged fathers, and we want men to be present in their families and to be really emotionally available and supportive of their friends. And we also want men to go to their jobs or run their businesses and kick ass and take names with that, which requires a ton of emotional energy and a ton of time. And a lot of men, myself included, are like, how do we do all of that? There's like, how do
Yeah.
we do all of that, you know?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's a very, I don't think that wanting men to do those things is in any way wrong.
Mhm.
I think it's just a very, very tall order. And I think a lot of men feel like there's so many ways to get it wrong. And especially in the emotional spheres where we don't historically have good role models of how to be emotionally expressive, how to be, good emotionally available friends, even how to be good emotionally available partners for that matter,
Mhm.
right? We're so conditioned to be sort of the strong silent type, and those stereotypes I think are softening and changing somewhat over time, but slowly.
Yeah.
And we're in this like awkward transition phase of we're supposed to do this thing but not too much, and that thing but not too much, and it's kind of
Mhm.
a an awkward space. And so I think a lot of men, again myself included, aren't quite sure what the right answer is, and they end up getting a little bit paralyzed and reverting back to the way they watch their fathers and grandfathers operate, um, or leaning hard into the sensitive, soft, emotional space that women have, I think, rightly wanted more of from men, but
Mhm.
then getting penalized in the dating world or in the relationship space for being too much of that. And we're like, what the hell,
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, there's a ton of other, kind of things that are challenging, but I think the other thing too, and this is just again kind of zooming even farther out, the world as it operates in the very sort of extractive capitalist sense, um, views not just men but especially men as hardworking units of production, and will take as much as individual men are willing to give. And the problem is you're penalized for not giving everything.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
we're like, well, how do we show up for our kids? How do we show up for our partners? How do we show up for our friends? And how do we show up for the company or boss or business that we run ourselves, in a way that is adequate in all those spaces? And I think most men end up feeling wildly inadequate in most, if not all, of those spaces.
Absolutely. Well, it feels like, this conversation in that we're having, even in the past couple of years, and I don't know if it has to do with like, you know, um, the isolation of the pandemic, or like things like Me Too, watching some of what's happening, politically in our culture. It feels like this conversation is like amplified. Do you get a sense of that?
100%. I mean, it feels like a crucible. It really
Mhm.
does.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of us individually and I think collectively, it feels like this space where there's a pressurization, and there's a lot more, again, in a good way, there's a lot more dialogue, a lot more discourse about men, masculinity, toxic masculinity, crisis of masculinity, what's happening to our boys, like all of that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
But there doesn't seem to be much that I've seen in the way of um, answers, solutions, right? They're like, oh, we have a problem. And we're like, yeah, no shit. We know we have a problem, right?
Yeah.
Men
Yeah.
know we have a problem. Everyone else knows we have a problem. And there's, growing bodies of evidence, data to support that in terms of outcomes, even with younger generations.
Hmm.
And I haven't seen somebody stand up and say like, yeah, we got a problem, and here's what we might think about doing about that. And so I think that men have this space of like, yeah, it's an
Yeah.
uncomfortable space. We're not sure what to do.
Hmm.
Uh, There's no simple one person solution or
Right.
kind of, one size fits all answer. But man, finding your way through a space like that, and while being afraid of faltering and getting it wrong, like that's a hard space.
Yeah. Well, it seems like, of the people that do stand up and say, "Hey, here's a solution," it seems to be some of like this dark web stuff and this
Totally.
very like, "Hey, let's go back even further, in time, and embrace some of these like really um uh just archaic ways of showing up. These more the word unevolved is kind of coming up
Yeah.
for me right now, and
Immature. Yeah.
yeah, and you're right. Like so many guys are like looking for just a light in the dark, and anyone who like, flickers one or turns one on that says, "Hey, I have the answer. I have a roadmap. I have a solution." People we're just like walking right towards it.
Yeah.
And it feels like maybe, we need voices, and I feel like, you seem to be one in the way that you've been articulating of this alternative way, this modeling um uh this answer to the call that I think the world has for a new kind of leadership for men.
Yeah. I have a kind of a metaphor that I think I use to talk to men when I do coaching with them, about what's happened since kind of mid 20th century feminism. And, just so it's really explicit, I think that feminism is a really important movement. So like, let's just leave that as a tenet. And if you think about men pre-feminism, it's that they, in the first half of the 20th century and before, it was so much that kind of adolescent boy, like where everything is about domination and control, and everything is hierarchically arranged. And so I picture sort of maybe like a 14 or 15-year-old boy in his mother's home, in his parents' home, but specifically as it relates to the feminine. So I'll talk about mothers. And kind of mid 20th century, the kind of first wave feminism was like stood up and was like, "Hey man, that's actually not cool anymore." Like, and I sort of had this like image of like mother taking her son by the ear and being like, "Fucking knock it off." Like there's sort of a well-deserved rebuke of poor behavior.
Yeah.
And I think about, again, I kind of picture a 14 or 15-year-old boy being sharply and appropriately rebuked by his mother, the feminine. And there's kind of two primary ways he might respond. One is he might get angry and defensive and kind of get bigger and kind of slam doors or kick the wall or swear at his mother or just generally be a shithead. And we were swearing on this. Yeah, is that fine?
Yeah.
I'm like, I've done it a bunch of times already. I don't know.
Yeah, you're good.
But often, there can be a very defensive, immature, angry response to the very appropriate rebuke for bad behavior. Not responsibility taking, not apologizing, largely defensiveness and anger. And I think that's a lot of what happened initially, when feminism first really got to be a social movement. I think it's also persisted in a fairly kind of in a quiet or maybe more underground, and to your reference to like dark web, red pill, incel kind of stuff, like that's the same kind of thing, right? It's an angry defensive response, where it's denying the fact that there's a problem. It's denying responsibility for previous actions. And it's just basically like, no, fuck you. I'm going to keep doing the same thing. The other possible response to the appropriate rebuke for bad behavior from the feminine is sort of a wilting, childlike, regressive response. It's sort of like getting soft and tearful and really like younger childlike. It's not the angry adolescent boy. It's the wilting, sad, tearful, younger child. And there's sort of almost an androgyny to that, right? Because it kind of reverts back to more of like a kind of a prepubescent period. And so that I think of as more the like soft spiritual man of the 70s and 80s. Like, when men first started figuring out, oh, women want something different, I'll be this soft spiritual guy. I'll be emotional, I'll be sensitive. And then there's a lot more conversation now where women are like, yeah, I don't actually want that. It's not hot, right? And because there is this sort of childlike, regressive, and even androgynous, meaning less masculine or less polarized version of that. And I think both the angry defensive response, the kind of more adolescent response, and that sort of getting smaller, regressive, childlike response are both the wrong way to respond to a very appropriate rebuke for bad behavior, because they're both child responses. They're not adult responses. And so I think the much more difficult and the more appropriate response to when bad behavior of your own has been called out or pointed to, I'll say of our own individually, but also men collectively,
Right.
it looks more like a real apology, right? It's taking ownership of like, oh yes, we actually, or I actually really got that one wrong. And, sort of atoning for that behavior and being like, what do I need to do to make this right? And here's my plan to make it different in the future, like a legitimate apology. And then the actual changed behavior. And like, that's an adult response to somebody kind of holding you accountable. So I sort of see this, the two bad options, and then there's sort of the third way, which is moving beyond the child or adolescent type response, but it has to be a totally new response. And I think that's a difficult thing to do individually, just because it requires a much higher degree of security and self-awareness and maturity. It's also a hard thing to do in the public eye, because for so many of those other two types of men who are not taking responsibility, who are not taking ownership, if you're actually willing to step into the space and say, oh yeah, we really fucked that up, like we really got that wrong, you end up being sort of a bit of a lightning rod for the, again, I think well-deserved hurt and even rage from women collectively. And then you sort of get driven back into the cave because you get beat to shit in the public eye. So like there are three bad options, one of which is much, much less bad. And I think that's the, kind of the more adult response. I'm still working on how to do that myself. Like it's not a like, oh, I have this all dialed in. But that's the thing that I aspire to.
Right. I have found too that there are things that do create challenges with that. It takes time and patience and grace with everybody, and for people to learn and grow, it's that can be a bumpy ride. And there's
I know it.
Yeah, right. And and like I know in my life, like it's like I've fumbled the ball like so many times, and even we talk about collectively as men, it's easy to point out like examples of guys who drop the ball as well. But do you see any growth, any progression, and any pockets of things that make you hopeful for men collectively happening in the world?
I do. I think I see that both in sort of public discourse, and I also see that just in the conversations that I have with my male friends and my female friends, actually. I think that everything starts with conversation, right? Like there can be some sort of internal awareness of like, hey, this thing is not actually working well. But then you have to be able to actually, acknowledge that it's a problem and have a real conversation about it. And so there's lots of conversations going on, some of which are more productive than others, and some of which propose, I think, healthier and less healthy answers and responses. But there's lots of conversation going on. I think that's a really, really positive indicator. And I look at, I'm 45. Most of my close male friends are within a few years of that. And so I look at our age, our generation of men, and I'm having very different conversations now than I was even 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, in part because of what's going on in society at large, in part because of what we as individual people are living through in our own personal lives. I do see sort of hope for change. To your point, I also see stubborn, regressive, destructive responses to some of that conversation, which I think is predictable. Different subsets of any group are going to respond to different challenges, different confrontations differently. But there's lots of conversation going on. I think it all starts with conversation in small scales like this one, and on large scales in books and really large podcasts and just media at large. Like there's lots of conversation going on, and I think there are a lot of people, a lot of men specifically, recognizing like we have to find a new way. We don't really necessarily know what that is or what it looks like, because no one has modeled it for us, but we have to find a new way. And we're sort of, a lot of us feel like we're fumbling in the dark to do that, but we're still continuing to fumble and look for the new way.
Yeah. I want to ask you about a topic that I know you've written about, and I find just so fascinating. And it's connected to a lot of what we're talking about, this idea of growth and evolution in our lives. And that's this idea of um and I don't know if you refer to it as masculine initiation, male initiation.
Hmm.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit about this concept, and maybe first for maybe people who are listening and who are like, "Whoa, like you know, $5 word is like masculine initiation. It's this big
Right.
thing." I wonder if you could explain a little bit about what that is, and maybe we can dive into that more.
Sure. Um, I think about initiations as transitions between stages or phases or modes of being. Um, and for boys into men and even in men between different stages of their life, generally speaking, those transitions happen as a result of some kind of crisis or failure.
Mhm.
Ultimately, it comes down to the realization generally foisted upon you from some external source, whether it's an individual or an organization or society at large, something happens and there's some begrudging realization that the way I've been operating so far doesn't work anymore. Like the tools I have been using to solve problems no longer works to solve the current problem. So it's ultimately it's a necessary failure. And for men, that can often be failure of relationship, can certainly be failure in the sort of business work world, in the financial sphere. It can be health crisis, but it can be a realization that what I've been doing so far doesn't work anymore. And so initiations then are organized, structured, and even ritualized responses to those crises, to those failures, in a way that there is a reorganization and often a recognition and a mandatory move into learning new ways of being, new skills, new self-awareness, new ways of relating, new ways of allocating resources, whatever it might be. I've done so much work in, health that it's a good example. So often people don't take their health seriously until they have some kind of scare. They're like, oh, my doctor thinks I might have prostate cancer, or
Hmm.
I'm pre-diabetic, or I'm 80 pounds overweight and I can't figure out how to lose weight and get healthier. Or my dad dies at 29 of cancer. And like, I don't have a health crisis, but there's one that's really close to me that really makes me think about mortality. That was my experience. So initiations then really are, in a general sense, they are ritualized transitions between modes or stages of being, and so that happens between the like child boy and adult man. It also happens between kind of different stages of progressively maturing sort of masculinity. It happens with girls and women as well. I don't really talk about that in part because I don't understand it.
Sure.
I understand it conceptually. I definitely don't understand experientially. So I
Yeah.
mostly just keep my mouth shut and let
Yeah.
somebody who knows more about it talk about it.
Uh-huh.
But the primary reorientation that I see in the transition between being a boy and being a man is the orientation from self-interest to contribution.
Mm.
Like that's kind of the transition that happens there. And primitive tribes, what we know from contemporary primitive tribes and what we know kind of historically is that it was really important that the adult members of the tribe contributed whatever they had to contribute. They have different skills, different abilities. The young masculine, so I'll call that the like young adult
Mhm.
males, typically are very contributive in that physical sphere, in the like protect, provide, procreate, right? It's all very physical, it's all very external. And so the orientation from being the boy, the competitive, hierarchical, kind of jostling among peers, sorting by hierarchy, like all of that stuff is such
Mhm.
a boy way of being. And it's important because it is how you actually develop competencies and skills and confidence.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all very self-interested. It's all very like, what can I get for me? It's all, very even narcissistic in that sense. And they're like, the whole world revolves around me. And in a lot of the, historical and traditional societies, the initiations involve some sort of symbolic ritualized death of that selfish hierarchical boy, and a rebirth of a new person, a new being. Often they're given new names and new places to live, and
kind of like what you see when they send them out into the woods, right? With nothing but like a rock and a spear, and like they gotta
100%.
they gotta go out and like face themselves, and like in a sense that was a symbolism of like this boy becomes a man, like that we're talking about.
So yeah, for sure. And there's actually James Hollis writes and organizes it, and so I'm taking his organization for the way the initiations work, because it's sort of little stages within that. Initially, and this is for boys, initially there has to be a forceful disconnection from mother, home, village, from the feminine in general, right? From the nurturing mother that you had as a child. And that is, as most of these initiations and transitions are, foisted upon the boy from outside, right? In the middle of the night, the male elders of the village, the uncles, the father, whoever, come and like kidnap the boy in the middle of the night and like take him away. Like it's a physical removal from his mother's protection. So there is that external component, and there is a disconnection from the mother, literal and figurative. So there's a disconnection. There's a ritualized symbolic death of that boy, and that looks a lot like a lot of different things. Sometimes they'll do stuff like they'll bury the boy underground with just a little tube to breathe out of, and there's like they're like underground overnight, like you're literally in, like you've been buried, right?
Oh wow.
There's lots of different ways different cultures do that, but the idea is the boy is no longer with us, the boy is gone. And then there is an awakening, a new sort of a rebirth. And just like when we are infants, it's a whole new world. There's a whole new set of things we need to learn. And so there's a lot of teachings instilled from the sort of village elders, whether that's in a sort of like organized way, or whether it's just the fathers and uncles and grandfathers get together and be like, hey, this is what it means to be a man in this culture. And there's a lot of teaching involved there. And then there is a stage of, to your point, kind of the hero's journey stuff, where you're sent out into the wilderness. The walkabout, the hero's journey, the vision quest, where there is a very solitary and terrifying experience in the world that the boy becoming a man has to learn how to navigate with the skills and knowledge that he's acquired over long periods of time, but especially during that sort of intensive transition and teaching period. And most of the time the boy survives.
Right.
And, I mean, I grew up in British Columbia and spent a lot of time, in the mountains and outside in general. And most of it wasn't by myself, and most of it wasn't scary, but sometimes it was. And those kinds of experiences are the places that you learn a lot about yourself, and so there's a confidence and a discipline and a self-awareness that comes out of those solitary experiences. And when the new man comes back to the group, there's a celebration, and again, often even a new name, a new identity. Sometimes a new household, because there's a new member of the tribe, and there's now a man present that wasn't present before. And so there is this kind of whole arc of that initiation or that transition that occurs. And I look at our society now and I see almost none of that, because through that transition, some of the primary teachings that should occur include the recognition that one's skills and talents and abilities and competencies are no longer to be applied in the service of self, in the service of glory and self-interest and winning, and domination. Like that's appropriate when you're a boy just kind of finding your way in the world. That's not appropriate as a way for an adult man to behave, because all it means is, I mean, this is the way the world is built now, right? We look out, we experience, we walk around in the world, and it's a very unsafe, precarious place because everyone's always sniping, everyone's, kind of snapping at your heels. And there's this ironic kind of paradox where on one hand, it does, that kind of intense competition and hierarchical arrangement does drive men to excel, to succeed at work or whatever else the thing that they pointed at is. And it comes at an incredibly high cost because there's an incredible amount of stress involved being in that precarious place. So that's how I think about the kind of boy to man initiation in a general sense. I've thought a lot about this both in terms of like, well, what do we do for those of us men who didn't go through anything even remotely similar to that?
Yeah.
At all.
I feel like I'm here raising like my hand for
same.
those. Yeah.
So there's sort of a retrospective engineering of like, how do I do some of that stuff to rearrange my own psyche 30 years later than it should have happened. There's a sort of delayed component to it there. So I think about it for myself. I think about it for the men that I'm close to, that I support as they're going through their own process. And especially I think about it in relation to my son. He just turned 11. He's coming up on those years where there's a lot of change and turmoil. And hopefully, if I can sort of sort through how to continue to teach him what it means to be an adult man in this society, there will be some version of initiation for him in that. Exactly what that looks like, I'm not sure, but I'm formulating as we go. I've got
Well, I'd be curious because I know we both have 11-year-old boys, and so if you do, make sure you share that out, because I'd be curious to know what it is that you do. I think about that a lot too, with a young boy on the precipice of these adolescent years and what that looks like. Because as we were just talking, I feel for me part of where my own I guess initiation experience was stunted had a lot to do with kind of the religious subculture and things like that in a sense kind of allowed me to navigate, especially as like this like young white straight like talented person like in the church. I actually didn't really have to face my own darkness.
Sure.
I found ways around it. I found ways to navigate through it, and was kind of given this just permission to just go about the world in whichever way that I chose.
Yeah.
And it really, I feel like stunted some of that for me.
For sure.
Because I think a lot of what you're talking about and what we have been talking about a lot is like, how do men like create and co-create like a safe world for everybody? And it starts with like us as individuals. And I don't know if it's the psychologist Carl Jung talking about, a safe man is someone who's faced his darkness, faced his limit, it has pushed himself to his edge and understands this. Then, then we can become safe for others. And I feel like that for me, like, has come like later in life as I've experienced like, loss and failure. I mean, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great if humans in general, in this case men, had the courage and self-awareness and just general wherewithal to relentlessly on a daily basis self-examine and do the hard inner work of facing darkness and looking at patterns and healing traumas and learning and like all this stuff. And that's just not the way it is, right? And that's kind of why I say like it comes to us in the form of some kind of crisis or failure. And I think that's, in a weird way, I think that's mandatory. Like I don't think it is reasonable to actually expect boys or young men to spontaneously have the capacity to do all of the kind of healing, growing, self-examining stuff. I think it has to come to us from the outside. In the boy to man initiation, it comes to us in the form of older, wiser, more experienced men coming to us and forcefully being like, hey, things are about to change for you for the better. Doesn't feel like it's for the better because it feels like a crisis and kind of there's like a big thing happening. But I think it's part of our responsibility as men who are on our own journeys and going through our own kind of learning maturation process and healing process is doing that for peers and doing that for our sons.
Yeah.
And we're in this awkward space of like I do not like older at all. I feel really ill-equipped to even kind of take my own son through some sort of initiatory process because I'm piecing it together. I didn't have that experience. I'm reverse engineering it. I'm guessing. I mean, I'm doing my best. But I think that's what we have to do at this cultural moment is do our best to piece together and to kind of do our individual healing, to do our collective healing, and then to also work with the younger generations and to kind of lead them through something, even though we ourselves weren't led through it.
Yeah, that's always tough. It sounds like, this idea of initiation can be is twofold. One, it could be something that is facilitated. It could be something that has more of a ceremonial, an orchestrated type of environment, and especially maybe for younger men and in making that transition. And then those things that are forced upon us, or even our own choosing, these moments of failure, of loss, of things like that. Maybe it's in those moments how often that we choose to respond that actually creates which way that initiatory experience leads, right? Like,
Totally.
For me, like having gone through things like divorce, whatever, I know for a lot, like, I guess it can make or break you depending on like what you do in that moment. When you face and you're
100%.
at rock bottom, when you're facing that darkness, how you choose to step forward and step out is going to choose where that initiation goes, right?
Totally. Well, and to your point, here's an example of that. In that kind of arc of initiation that starts with a sort of disconnection from the feminine and a ritualized death. I think I look out at the world and I see a large percentage of adult men going through the world, going through their lives in a very zombie-like kind of half alive, not carrying like vital energy, like they're zombies. And I think about that largely through the lens of that's how we're sort of conditioned to be, because then we're cooperative cogs in the very large capitalist machine. But I think about it also through the lens of failed initiation. I think about it as if we have gone through the space where we didn't have a mother, or I mean, I suppose any parental figure, our attachment figure, but especially the feminine, if we didn't have a mother who was securely attached and attuned to our needs and who was emotionally absent, either for reasons of anxiety or avoidance or working too much or whatever, we've already had that disconnection from the feminine. It's sort of the ritualized death of the boy who can feel nurtured and safe and held under his mother's wing. So you've already had the very beginning stage of that boy to man initiation and a complete absence of all of the revitalizing rebirth and the sort of the teachings part of it. So I think you kind of get stuck in this undead zombie kind of state. And I think a lot of men have had that experience in a really tragic way in society. And I look out and I see men 2, 3, 4, 5 decades later still in that state. So to your point about certain moments or certain experiences being really pivotal, I think that's one of them that can, things early in life, even relatively small things, can cast really long shadows.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. What are some things, that as parents, and I know some, we're still trying to figure this out, raising kids and maybe often doing some things differently, charting some new paths. Um, raising, yeah, you have a son. I have a son. What are some things, now this is daring to that, we have a lot of parents listening here. Um, what are some things you're doing in your own world, in your own life, in your own home to kind of facilitate a healthy vision for what it means to be a man?
Yeah. I mean, part of it, one of the things certainly is, um, well, I think about the things that my father wasn't able to do for me that I wish he would. One of which was just expressing affection.
Mm,
Another of which is apologizing when he gets it wrong, when he got
mm,
it wrong. And probably the third one is just being really authentic about the expression of the emotion, including difficult emotions. Like I
mm,
cry in front of my son all the time. It's
mm.
totally normalized in our household. I apologize to him more frequently than I would like to have
Sure.
reason to.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm really physically and verbally affectionate. And those
Mm,
are things that I desperately wanted from my own father and didn't ever get,
yeah.
even in later years. And so those are things that I've, just because of my own personal experience, been attuned to with the way I relate to my boy.
Mm,
But I think that's also something that I've also brought into even my, to my male friendships.
yeah.
It's the same pattern of warmth and care and softness and appreciation and love. It's the same acknowledgement when I fucked up and accountability for that. It's the same openness with difficult emotions. Like I cry in front of my male friends. I won't say regularly as an often, but like when I need to. That's a
Yeah.
very authentic thing that happens.
That
And I think
permission,
that
that permission is there. That space is there for you to
totally,
be able to do that. Yeah.
totally. Well, and that's, I had a not necessarily like momentary epiphany, but sort of a progressive realization 10, 12 years ago. I looked at who I was friends with, and I had good people in my life. But I looked, especially, I was in therapy at the time, and we were talking a lot about, my history with my dad and that kind of stuff. And I looked at my male friends, and I realized that they were good people, but we did not have a very, meaningful, emotionally authentic relationship. We just were like, well, you're good people and we'll be friends and we'll hang out and we'll do stuff together. And I kind of made a decision somewhere around 10 years ago. I was like, I have to, well, at the time I thought I have to find good male friends. Since then, I've sort of reoriented that to be like, I have to create good male friendships. And I now have 10 years later, because it's taken a long time, an amazing group of really loving, mature, authentic male friends. But that doesn't just drop into your lap. You have to like go looking for it and or create it very intentionally. And I let my boy see those friendships. Like he's around my male friends. He sees the way I relate to them. So I think modeling is a big part of it too. Um, like my dad, he had friends, but I never saw any kind of authentic emotional relating with them.
Mm,
And some of that's generational, and some of that's just who he was as a person. But I make a point of letting my boy see into some of those friendships so that he knows what healthy male friendships can look like.
yeah.
That's
Man, those,
that's
yeah.
kind of those are the big pieces for me.
Yeah. Those are great. I mean, I think those are so useful and practical for so many guys. Uh, man, like we could just keep talking on and on about this stuff. I love this topic. I know you do as well. I know that you're working with men. You're doing men's coaching. People might be familiar with you already, but just kind of coming to a close here. Maybe just spend a moment talking about what you're up to right now and the work you're doing with men, where people can maybe connect with that work. What's going on?
Sure. The easiest place and probably the place that I'm most active is on Instagram. It's just at Dallas Hartwig, is my account. I'll every now and then remind people that I do men's coaching work, and if anyone's interested, they can send me a direct message on Instagram.
Hmm.
Um, I have a website that I'm not super active on.
Uh-huh.
Most of my stuff goes into Instagram, but dallashartwig.com is my website. My men's coaching work at this point is individual one-on-one work. I've had a lot of requests for facilitating men's groups.
Mhm.
I detest doing virtual groups, so I've kind of resisted those requests.
Yeah.
But that's something that may be kind of coming in the works.
Mhm.
I've also had a lot of requests for men's retreats. That may also be coming at some point. I don't have concrete plans on that right now. And I'm actually also in the early stages of starting a new business for men that will be initially based on sort of getting men's physical health metrics lined up. And this is kind of, the way I think about humans in general is very largely influenced by Maslow's work, his hierarchy of needs, which a lot of people know about. And right at the base of that pyramid is like the very physical survival needs. And so it's, food and movement and sleep and safety, and those
Mhm.
are the things that, my last book, The Four Season Solution, talked a lot about, And what I found in my earlier work with the Whole 30 program was that when people made changes, and the Whole 30 program is strictly a food-based program, it's just eating different food for 30 days and then taking
Mhm.
some notes with reintroduction. But what literally thousands of people learned through that experience was that improving their physical health spontaneously opened up spaces for them to have psychological, spiritual, emotional um, bursts of growth. So
Mhm.
people would say, boy, this is crazy, but like I changed my food for 30 days and I'll now decide to leave my toxic relationship or go back to grad school or play guitar again or finally start going to therapy or whatever. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And through the lens of Maslow's hierarchy, uh, I understand that as when you cut away the anchors, the roadblocks in the physical health sphere, all of a sudden there's this intrinsic buoyancy that we have as humans where we are then spontaneously interested in and available and resourced for more interesting spaces, and those
Oh
are
my
the
gosh, yeah.
much deeper, more interesting, and that's how I've become interested in all of the emotional and relational spheres that I now focus on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it
And
makes so much
so,
sense, right?
yeah, I mean, that's
The days that I feel like I'm most active, I feel like everything in me is more alive.
totally, totally.
Right.
And so so my next business then is based on physical health, kind of. And it's a little bit of a Trojan horse actually, because
Mhm.
I'll be selling it uh, as a as an AI based app
Mhm.
to optimize and streamline your physical health metrics. But I don't care about any of that stuff per se,
Mhm.
only to the extent that that is a roadblock to the much more rich, beautiful, meaningful experience of being a human. So I'm doing that too. So there's lots of stuff going on.
Amazing. Man, thank you so much for just sharing some of your life experience and your perspectives on stuff. This is so great. Thank you for carving out the time with us today.
I appreciate it. It was good stuff.
All right. Thanks. We'll talk soon.
Take care.